About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Hello, welcome to Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and through this series of programs, I'm sharing some of the history, explaining some of the ideas and experiments, and introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research. We'll also take your questions and explore some news items as we go along. So today, we're starting a new phase. This is episode 4 in our ongoing exploration. And over the last couple of weeks, we've begun this 12-part series on evolving models of consciousness, the history of explorations and discoveries of what the mind is and how it works. You can catch up on them on the KXCR.org site or on our website, noeticmoments.org. And if you did catch an earlier show, you may remember that we generally have 2 ways of thinking about consciousness. In the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is being awake and aware and knowing what's going on around us. You've seen that on the television if you haven't actually had an EMT ask you what day it is. In the field of noetics, though, as it has emerged over the past 100 years, consciousness is the processes and products of mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's profound human experience, and ultimately, consciousness is what connects us all. In the first few episodes, I've introduced myself and how the field came to be. I talked about Sigmund Freud, who opened the door to understanding the processes of mind in the early 1900s. I introduced some of Carl Jung's ideas as well, who developed the idea that our own individual consciousness must be understood within the framework of what he called the collective consciousness. And then I skipped a few decades, and I introduced Charles Tart, who established the idea of states of consciousness, each with its own set of physiological, emotional, and mental characteristics. Today, we're exploring the work of Julian Jaynes, who was alive during all of those previous workers' studies and explored how what he called our bicameral mind affects our experience and our thought. Jaynes was a bit of a contrarian. His non-conforming actions were often justified by a set of principles. For example, he was a conscientious objector in World War II, and he refused to accept the PhD when he'd earned it because somehow it was contrary to his principles. He was deeply interested in how consciousness, which he defined as the human ability to introspect, could come about. He worked and studied at several universities in North America and the UK, pursuing that interest. And in the process, he co-authored a number of papers on animal learning and behaviorism, which he later stated were way off the track of what he was seeking. And then he produced one book. It's called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. This book offered a profound and highly controversial theory based on his observation of animals and his study of ancient Greek literature. suggesting that for most of humanity's existence, the two sides of our brains did not communicate. They were not synchronized, and that therefore human beings, in his terms, had not been conscious. They were, Jaynes suggested, functioning more or less as automatons, following culturally ingrained norms and totally unaware of their own individual nature. He used Homer's Iliad to demonstrate that in ancient Greece and prior cultures, the rules of daily life were structures, he called them structions, in the left hemisphere, and that when information was received from the right hemisphere by that left hemisphere, it was perceived as a voice from outside the body, as a god. Each community throughout those millennia prior to ancient Greece would explain the phenomenon to the new generation and give it a name. And so we had many names of many gods with many different sets of characteristics. I'm going to play a video now that explains some of how that works.
In the middle of the island Santorini today, all this volcanic dust was put into the air, vast tracts of land uninhabitable, famine everywhere, huge hordes of individuals crossing across the lands. Now here you are bicameral man. You've got the right side of your brain issuing authority, and you have the left side of your brain surviving day to day. Well, what happens? You are faced now, after the volcano, by thousands of hungry refugees who do not speak your language, who do not share your God. Hundreds of new gods are being introduced into this area. So, what happens is, your God and the noise of all the other gods begins to wane a lot. Remember, this is your personal God. Okay? Your personal God begins to wane, and the left-hand side of the brain, the housekeeping side of the brain that solves problems, becomes the dominant brain. You become problem solving, you become your own authority, you become conscious.
That was Kitty Johnson in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in her TED Talk explaining the bicameral mind. Based on this idea, Jaynes stated that consciousness, as the ability to consider one's internal state, was born when the Bronze Age collapsed, which, as Kitty suggested, was when the volcano Thera went off in the island of Santorini. When the language of metaphors began to become a part of life in Western culture, then, Jaynes suggested, the two hemispheres of the brain began to function more fully as one system, dominated by the left brain, which was able to observe and track and, as he put it, introspect. Another way to think about what he's suggesting is that consciousness is not innate, but learned. Specifically, he said in the 1990 edition of his book that consciousness is based on and accessed by language. That is, the ability to see inside, to think about ourselves, is based on language. He said the non-conscious bicameral mind is based on verbal hallucinations, that is, hallucinating the images into verbal sounds. The breakdown, then, of this bicameral mind precedes consciousness. And he said, the double brain of bicamerality is based on the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex being organized differently from today's functional lateralization. So the question becomes, where did this idea of two sides of the brain, what Jaynes called the bicameral brain, come into play? You'll remember that neither Freud nor Jung, nor even Charles Tart, talked about the brain when they were talking about mind and consciousness. How did this start? Well, In the period around World War II and the years following it, there was an emerging new science called brain surgery or neurology, neurophysiology, and several branches of a science and an art that explored how the brain and the body are interconnected, what was going on there. And during those years, people began to document that if they put a probe in a different part of the brain, or if a surgery or an illness caused a part of the brain to not function, then the body and the personality seemed to change, that things were different. For example, if someone had an epileptic seizure and a part of their brain were removed in an attempt to control the epilepsy that they'd been dealing with, not just one seizure, but many, I'm sure, then they would find that the person would have troubles with certain memories or with certain physical abilities or verbal abilities. They found that people who had strokes in certain parts of the brain would not be able to speak, for example, a series of words, but could sing those words and be just fine. So there's a number of new understandings that emerged in that period, the 1940s through the 1970s, when Jaynes was just beginning to do his work. And what had emerged was this notion of the left brain being one form of function and the right cerebral cortex. That's what we mean when we say right or left brain, this overlaying cortex that is definitive of the human. It is divided into two portions, and there is something that connects them called the corpus callosum. And in some people, there is a very relatively small corpus callosum, and in others, there is a greater corpus callosum, increasing the movement back and forth between the two halves of the cerebral cortex. So as we began to understand that there was something going on in the structure of the brain itself, that added to Jaynes' interest and Jaynes' idea of what was actually happening when he looked back at the ancient literature. He pointed out that ancient Greek poetry, particularly Homer's Iliad, was perhaps the earliest of the ancient writings that could be understood in modern terms. Well, he completely left out the Vedas, and he completely left out Egyptian hieroglyphics, which at that time were very poorly understood. So we now have a much broader record. But still, the notion that the right brain and the left brain function differently, and that there might have been a time when they didn't function together in the same way they do now, and that may have led to a different way of relating to the world, does open up a whole range of possibilities. In fact, those possibilities have been being explored by a number of people in these subsequent years. And in a world of materialist science, the idea that consciousness must be a function of the structure of a material object, the brain, seems to be far more acceptable than other ideas, such as the ones we will be exploring next week. Now, as I said, this model is quite controversial, as it separates consciousness from all other mental activity, what we are aware of and what we are not, what's going on in the body, what's going on in our thinking, what's stored in our memories, etc. Yet, as with all the other models we've been offered over the years, this one offers us a clue for beginning to explore and understand how what we think and how we think and what our mental experience is and how it affects us. So Julian Jaynes, I've never agreed with him fully, but I really do appreciate that he went as far back as he could to try to understand what it is that makes modern culture different from indigenous cultures around the world. And ultimately, it's that left brain overpowering the right brain, the logical, analytical, verbal processing becoming our dominant mode, and our intuitive, holistic, relational being being underplayed, underutilized, and underaccepted. The field of noetic science could be defined as how we can go about experiencing both minds, both aspects of the brain, fully in an integrated fashion. All right, so it's time to look at a book. And if you want to know more about the brain, there's many books out there. But my favorite is written by Jill Bolte Taylor. She had a stroke, and she gave a TED Talk, and she wrote a book, and it's called My Stroke of Insight, in which she explains the phenomenal experience of being aware of the fact that her right brain and her left brain were now not functioning together and going from one into the other, back and forth and back and forth. And it's a beautiful description, and on the TED Talk, a 20-minute talk, and the book explains quite a bit of the science as well as the personal experience. Strongly recommend this book if you have not encountered it, or the TED Talk, Jill Bolte Taylor, My Stroke of Insight. Over the weeks to come, we'll take a look at others of the many books written on the aspects of this science. I'll give you a couple of minutes of a review, and we'll try to keep up with the new titles as they come out. And, of course, if you know of a book or video you'd like me to address, please send me an email. You can reach me at ruth@noeticmoments.org. I'll take a look at what you have to offer. And if you don't want to send an email, just go to the website and click on the form and fill it in. It'll get to me. Thanks. That sound tells us that it's time to look at what's going on in the news today, or to answer one of your questions. And again, if you would like me to explore some particular topic, or you have a specific question about consciousness, about the science, or about the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or anything else that talks about noetics, let me know on our website, noeticmoments.org. One of the things I'm seeing a lot in the social media today has to do with what's called ascending. What does it mean to ascend? Now, in the biblical sense, ascension is defined in only one situation, and that is when the center of the gospel, Jesus of Nazareth, has died on the cross in the Bible, has been resurrected on the third day in the tomb, and after a number of days teaching and wandering around and talking to people and connecting with people in various places, Jesus then goes to a mountain and he says, I have to leave you so that you will do your own work. And he ascends. We don't know what the details of that are. That word has been applied in many ways in the years following, almost 2,000 years now. And what we think is going on is that people are calling any increase in ability, any increase in conscious capabilities, a form of ascension. In fact, there are some people who are suggesting that humanity may be now going through a kind of a growth period, a growing pains period, where we are ascending from one form of humanity to a new form of humanity, or that Western culture, which is now dominant culture across the world, some of you know that I call it the empire culture that formed about 6,000 years ago and appears to be shifting into a new form of culture today. This culture may be ascending as it shifts into this new form of culture. That is, it's one that includes more people at a higher level of consciousness than previous forms of culture. Another suggestion is that there are individuals who are reaching a state of consciousness such that they will no longer be required to stay in their body or to go through the death process. This idea is related to the Christian idea. So if Jesus did it and he said, these things and greater shall you do, some people think that's an injunction to all of us to learn how to do the same. So ascension is in the air these days in many different ways. And if you run across the word in your social media or on a website or in someone's teachings, you might pay attention. How is that word being used? Could be any of those forms. And which one makes a difference? All right. So much for what's in the news today. We're running to the end of our time. I hope that you have found today's program to give you a different notion or a different insight into the nature of consciousness, the realization that we do have two different aspects of the brain. They function in different ways, and during this time period that I call the Empire Culture, which started about 6,000 years ago, we're beginning to experience, or we've been experiencing, the left brain, the analytical verbal brain, as our dominant form of function. But we may be moving into a new time where we reintegrate the holistic relational right brain activities more fully into our daily lives and work. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, next week, we'll be exploring a very different model of what consciousness is and how it works. It's based on the idea of electromagnetic fields, or possibly a field that can't be measured on the electromagnetic scale. The idea was introduced by an engineer turned psychologist, Kurt Levine, way back in the 50s, was picked up by an evolutionary biologist, Rupert Sheldrake, who developed the concept more fully in the 80s, 90s, and the early part of this 21st century. So we'll get to explore what it is that they're talking about and how it affects us and our lives in the world. We're out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we referred to on the show, along with past shows that are in archive form. And they have links for the various things we play on the show. You can send me your comments there and your questions, and I'll do my best to get those answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio in heavenly Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.